Pawn e2 to e4. Pawn e7 to e6. Pawn d2 to d4. Pawn d7 to d5. Knight b1 to d2. Knight g8 to f6. Pawn e4 to e5. Knight f6 to d7. Bishop f1 to d3. Pawn c7 to c5. Pawn c2 to c3. Knight b8 to c6. Knight g1 to e2. Pawn c5 takes d4. Pawn c3 takes d4. Knight d7 to b6. Castle kingside. Bishop f8 to e7. Knight d2 to f3. Castle kingside. Bishop c1 to f4. Bishop c8 to d7. Rook a1 to c1. Knight c6 to b4. Bishop d3 to b1. Knight b6 to c4. Queen d1 to b3. Rook a8 to c8. Knight e2 to c3. Rook c8 to c7. Knight f3 to d2. Knight c4 takes d2. Bishop f4 takes d2. Knight b4 to c6. Queen b3 to a4. Knight c6 takes e5. Bishop b1 takes h7, check. King g8 takes h7. Queen a4 takes a7. Knight e5 to c4. Bishop d2 to f4. Queen d8 to a8. Queen a7 takes a8. Rook f8 takes a8. Bishop f4 takes c7. Rook a8 to c8. Bishop c7 to f4. Knight c4 takes b2. Knight c3 to e2. King h7 to g8. Rook c1 takes c8, check. Bishop d7 takes c8. Rook f1 to c1. Knight b2 to c4. Rook c1 to b1. Pawn b7 to b6. Bishop f4 to c7. Bishop c8 to b7. Pawn a2 to a4. Bishop e7 to d6. Bishop c7 takes d6. Knight c4 takes d6. Rook b1 takes b6. Pawn e6 to e5. Pawn d4 takes e5. Knight d6 to c4. Rook b6 takes b7. Knight c4 takes e5. Rook b7 to b5. King g8 to f8. Pawn f2 to f4. Knight e5 to d3. Rook b5 takes d5. Knight d3 to b2. Pawn a4 to a5. King f8 to e7. King g1 to f2. King e7 to e6. Rook d5 to d4. King e6 to f5. King f2 to e3. King f5 to e6. Rook d4 to b4. Knight b2 to d1, check. King e3 to f3. King e6 to d5. Rook b4 to d4, check. King d5 to c5. Rook d4 takes d1. King c5 to c6. Pawn a5 to a6. King c6 to b6. Rook d1 to d6, check. King b6 to a7. Rook d6 to f6. Pawn g7 to g6. Pawn f4 to f5. King a7 to b8. Rook f6 takes f7. Pawn g6 takes f5. Pawn a6 to a7, check. King b8 to c8. Pawn a7 to a8, promoting to queen, checkmate.